All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon in this education, getting ready to flip the switch on cannabis legalization. I'm Mike Strachan, and I'm the Mayor of the Village of Torquay, and I'm also the Vice President of Villages, Resort Villages, and Northern Communities. Before we get into this session, we need to talk about your safety. And I want you to quickly note the emergency exits and AED locations marked on page 24 and 25 of your convention handbook. Please have a look at them. This session is actually being recorded. That means if you want to ask a question, I would respectfully ask that you go to the microphone, state your name, your community, and ask your question. And when you're asking the question, please use the microphone because we need everybody in the room to hear not only our presenters, but so we can record the session and it'll be on our YouTube channel. So we do have two presenters today, and for their full bios, you can go onto our event-based application and read about them. So this session is being sponsored by Myers Norris Penny, and we have Craig Katarna Gates, National Lead for Public Sector Services here on their behalf, and he's going to introduce our speakers. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good afternoon. My name is Craig Katarna Gates. I'm a partner in MNP's Saskatchewan consulting practice, and my passion is supporting effective and outcomes-based governments in our great province. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session, getting ready to flip the switch on cannabis legalization. And MNP is proud to be a sponsor of the session. I know from the conversations I've had with a variety of people around the province on this topic that there is a mix of viewpoints on legalization. Many would have preferred that this just not be our reality. Many others would have preferred that we'd taken a step-by-step approach with perhaps decriminalization. But as leaders, we lead based upon the circumstances that are put before us. The question now is, how do we approach this reality in a responsible manner with a focus on the aims that on the outcomes we aim to balance? I'm really looking forward to the discussion today from our panel in order to better understand the opportunities ahead and the role for us as leaders. We have two great experts here today, and I know we'll be more knowledgeable and prepared at the end of the session. Now, before we get started, I wanted to provide you some context on why MNP thought it was important to have a visible role on this topic today. Now, MNP is the largest provider of professional business services to the legitimate cannabis industry. I want to emphasize that again, the legitimate cannabis industry. I don't want you thinking that our firm full of wild and crazy accountants and consultants, suddenly that we just all went up in smoke. So over the past 7 years, we have been a leader in in helping the growth and evolution of the medicinal marijuana industry. And then as the industry has evolved, we have too. We are today supporting businesses and governments to bring order, rigor, and structure to the area of recreational cannabis. In the process, we've learned an extensive amount about strategy, operations, financial compliance, security, and risk in this sector. A key goal of legalization of cannabis is to eliminate the illicit market in Canada. As the Premier noted this morning, this presents us with health, public safety, and other challenges. One important thing we've observed at MNP through our work with governments is that we cannot simply think of cannabis in the same way as alcohol or tobacco when it comes to regulations and management. There are important distinctions in the current state, potential use, customer experience, quality management, enforcement, distribution, and health effects of cannabis. Today's session is critical to involving our knowledge and preparedness as leaders in our communities. And I look forward to hearing the insights of our panelists and the questions from you as audience members. So thank you all for joining the session. As Mike mentioned, I have the pleasure of just briefly introducing our two speakers today. and because Lorne is stepping in for Derek King, who is ill, I thought I'd just take a moment and introduce them very briefly. I know Dale's bio is in the package, but Dale Tesarowski, first of all, is the Executive Director of Corporate Initiatives with Saskatchewan Justice. I asked Dale, what's something interesting I can tell the crowd? And he said, well, I've been in Saskatchewan now for 13 years, originally a Manitoba guy. And he's tasked with bringing clarity on behalf of the province to this topic of recreational cannabis. So I didn't ask Dale if he's currently a user of the product or not, but I suspect by the end of sorting all this out, he may have some frayed nerves and he may need to become a cannabis user by the end of this, Dale. The second panelist we have today is Lorne Randa. Lorne is stepping in, as I said, for Derek King. Lorne's a partner at Brownlee LLP, based out of Edmonton. And he's Edmonton or Calgary? Edmonton, thank you. He's been a minor football coach for 15 years, so that's something interesting for us to know about Lorne. And his passion is for municipal development law and privacy. And as soon as he said privacy, I knew there was nothing more I could share with you about Lorne and his background. So anyways, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our two panelists this afternoon.
I need our Foreign Affairs Minister's step stool to be tall enough for you folks. Thanks, Craig and Mayor, for the introduction. I noticed that Torquay was nearer to Estevan than Weyburn, and that's good for me because my son's a Bruin and not a Red Wing. So stop by and watch them play. Valentine's Day night is a good night to bring your wife to a hockey game. They're playing Weyburn, actually. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. We'll work our way through it. I don't mind being interrupted with questions, though. So if you have questions as we're going through, please go to a mic and ask. I don't mind being derailed in any fashion at all. So it's probably better to ask a question while you're thinking of it instead of trying to remember what it is later. So because this is being recorded, I'm not going to make my usual moose jaw jokes, but I can ask that how many other lawyers are in this room? And seeing none, that's good. I won't have to slow down for anyone to keep up. I understand that there's some unease about cannabis legalization, and I must confess that I share that unease. If I had my choice of files to take over, cannabis legalization probably wouldn't be one of them, partly because I've never, ever even smoked a cigarette, let alone a joint, and it's kind of an unusual topic to take up. I've learned a lot about cannabis and the cannabis industry, both legal and non-legal, and there is much more to learn as we get closer to legalization. Because, though, you're feeling a little uneasy, I hope to alleviate some of your concerns today, and if not, I can promise, although I'm not a politician, I can promise that if there's something that I can help with later, I'm more than happy to do that. And my email and phone number, I think, are on the slides. My email certainly is, but I'm no different than any other civil servant in Saskatchewan. My name, dale.tesarowski@gov.sk.ca, will find me. But if that's too complicated for the lawyers in the room, cannabis reform, all one word, at gov.sk.ca will also get to me. We wanted to create a mailbox that didn't come directly to me from some of the people in our communities that may not be as easy to deal with as others. So we created this magical mailbox to hide behind. I am, though, and I'm going to apologize for it now, going to apologize for being a little bit on the high level in our discussions with, okay, I didn't mean for that pun to come out, but if there's any file where puns are possible, this is it. There's high, there's joint, there's grow, all sorts of words have multiple meanings, and they all have some import with respect to cannabis legalization. So in any event, I'm going to sort of stay on the high level, simply because we have a few by-elections in the mix, and we don't want to get too particular with respect to things when we are in that situation. So that's the full spelling of my name. Again, dale.tesarowski@gov.sk.ca will find me. I work for a branch that deals with policy work in the government of Saskatchewan for the Ministry of Justice. Our ministry was just broken up last week, so we're now two ministries again. We're court justice and we're corrections and policing. So we're not quite sure where we're going to end up, or whether we're going to still have this really fancy long name once we're finished. But in any event, my email is easy to replicate and to move forward with. By way of background, cannabis legalization was a Liberal campaign promise when they ran in 2015. And when I was appearing before the Legislative Committee in October, they were pretty hard on Saskatchewan for not being ready and not having plans in place for legalization. And I said in response that, well, how could we prepare ourselves for legislation that hasn't been finalized yet? And they said, well, it was a campaign promise, don't you know? And I said, well, that didn't help me very much, but it didn't go over all that well. The cannabis legalization is being accomplished through the introduction of one main piece of legislation. It's Bill C-45. It's called the Cannabis Act, which is a lot better than some of the longer, funnier names that they're creating for legislation in Ottawa. And it was introduced almost a year ago in April of 2017. The bill states that the legalization will take place by July of 2018. And they are very particular about that language because they didn't want Canada Day to become Cannabis Day, so they're avoiding July 1st like the plague. It might mean June 30th, it might mean July 7th, it might be the end of July, assuming that the Senate doesn't amend the bill as it proceeds through hearings later this winter. So it'll be sometime in July, and we're readying ourselves for that implementation date. As a province, we aren't all that happy with that time frame. We had originally been talking about at least a year or maybe even 18 months from the time the bill was passed to have it come into force. And instead, we were given 14 months from the time it was introduced. So our time to get ready and to think about all the different things we have to think about was compressed significantly. And although we and other jurisdictions tried to get the federal government to change their minds, we were spectacularly unsuccessful in that respect. And they haven't budged one bit. There are a number of considerations for the legislation. It has several main purposes. And we agree with these purposes. There's no problem with any of this. We are to protect the health of young persons by restricting access to cannabis. We're to deter illicit activities with cannabis through appropriate sanctions and enforcement measures. We want to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis. And that's a particular reference to people being charged with simple possession of cannabis. And those cases going to court or being dealt with outside of the justice system through alternative measures for adults or extrajudicial sanctions for young persons. And we also want to enhance the public awareness of the health risks associated with cannabis use. And in that respect, what we're trying to do is to say that although cannabis is going to be, well, let me be particular, cannabis for some people who are a certain age who possess less than a certain amount will be able to lawfully have cannabis, that cannabis still is a potentially dangerous drug. It has effects that aren't good for people, and it poses health risks for people. So we want to help people understand that using that drug may not be in their best interest, and that if they do decide to use it, they make it on a more informed basis than just because the mayor of Torquay is going to. Eliminating the illegal market, though, here is key. Even with introduction of legalized cannabis, we know that we're not going to eliminate 100% of the illegal market. When they introduced cannabis in Colorado, for example, they initially knocked out 25% of the illegal market, and they've gradually displaced the illegal market as they were sort of moving away from their implementation date and are working more with the legal product in their jurisdiction. But protecting young people is also very important. And we want to limit exposure to kids in schools in particular, because that's a message that we've gotten from just about everybody, that cannabis is particularly bad for young persons. Their minds are still developing. I have a 32-year-old and his mind is still developing. But the medical community is pretty satisfied that at about age 25, the brain has pretty much finished its growth, and the use of cannabis won't be as bad for you than if you were younger than that. We also know, though, that the largest cannabis user market today are 16 to 24-year-olds. So as we move towards minimum age in Saskatchewan, that's a factor that we have to take into account, because if we want to displace the illegal market, we don't want to continue to make a product available or to not have a product that is lawful, at least for part of that age group. The Act is basically divided into different parts, and there are some areas that are solely federal responsibility. There are some that are provincially based, and there are some that are in between. With respect to some of the federal responsibilities, they've set up an adult public possession limit of 30 grams. And I know, because I had to ask, oh, how much is 30 grams of marijuana? That's a lot. It's probably a handful. So it's 28 grams is an ounce. So if you were a kid and you heard people tell, I'm going to get, an ounce of marijuana, that was a lot of marijuana. And it still is. So the lawful possession limit for adults is going to be 30 grams. And that's the public possession limit. So one can have more than that at home. So you can go to the marijuana or the cannabis store and purchase your 30 grams and then go home and then go back and purchase another 30 grams. There's no daily limit. There's no total possession limit. It's different than catching fish, where you can only have so many fish in your freezer at once. It's not like that at all. And whether that's good or bad, that's just kind of the way that it is, because if you do impose those kinds of limits, we have to figure out how we're going to enforce it. And do we want our police occupied by going in to look at inside people's homes and sort of with their little weigh scales attached to their belt? weighing a bunch of product, and we don't. So the federal government's also responsible for trafficking. It's going to be trafficking for significant amounts of a product of cannabis. It's going to be called social sharing if it's less than that. So right now, if I were to hand my friend the mayor a joint, I've actually committed an offense. That's trafficking in a controlled substance. Under the new law, that's not going to be an offense. So I can share up to 30 grams of product with another individual. I can't charge him for it because the only people permitted to retail cannabis will be people who have provincially approved licenses. But I can share with him up to 30 grams of product. Advertising and packaging is also a federal responsibility, and that poses a whole bunch of challenges too, because you don't want the packaging to be sexy or appealing, particularly to young persons, but you want it to be informative enough so that it can tell the consumer what the product is, how much the THC level or the psychoactive substance in the drug is, so that they have an idea of what kind of effect it may have on them, and to show that it's been approved. And by that I mean it's been grown in a safe manner, in a consistent manner, so the THC level for this package is the same as for that package. So that's a federal responsibility. They're also creating a seed-to-sale tracking system, which is really more an accounting system, to show that there is no diversion or inversion into a market. So if a retail establishment has purchased X amount of cannabis, they should only be able to sell that same amount. They shouldn't be able to sell a greater amount, which means that something is coming in that shouldn't be coming in from another source, most likely an illegal one. And production, the cultivation and processing of cannabis is a federal responsibility as well. There are some joint, here's another pun, this one I meant because I put it in italics. There are some joint responsibilities, and one of those is impaired driving, and that's a subject that is near and dear to me because I'm a criminal law lawyer, and one of my files that I willingly accepted was impaired driving, and I'm quite familiar with this particular subject, but the investigation of drugged impaired drivers and the prosecution of those are joint responsibilities. So the federal government is responsible for creating criminal law legislation, but it's up to the province to implement and enforce it, for example. And in Saskatchewan, at least, the prosecution of drug cases is done by the federal government through the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, not by our provincial crown attorneys. If we create provincial offenses, though, and we will in all likelihood, there's the high part, for prohibiting the use of cannabis in a vehicle, for example. Say the police see someone smoking a joint in a car. They can pull that car over, we can charge the driver, and that's a provincial prosecution. So again, another example of how there's shared responsibility. We have a federal age limit of 18 years, but a province can alter that upward. And Saskatchewan is on the cusp, I hope, of making that decision in the next month. Some jurisdictions have set 18 as their minimum age. Alberta, for example, is one. Quebec is another. But most of the others are falling at age 19, which coincides with their alcohol minimum age. And Manitoba is an exception to that rule, which is they have 18 for alcohol, but they're going to have 19 for cannabis. Public health, obviously, is a shared responsibility. Education and public awareness. And one of our favorite topics, taxation, is a joint responsibility. And you've all heard from, I think it was December, where the ministers of finance met and they agreed that for the excise tax for cannabis, 75% will be coming to a province or a territory, and 25% will be retained by the federal government. So that's certainly a step in the right direction because they started at 50-50. And home cultivation is another example. The feds say 4 plants maximum, 2 of which can be flowering at any time. So you can't have 4 plants that are about to be harvested at the same time. You have to be adept enough about this to grow them start them at different times so that they're ready for cultivation or harvesting at a later time. Saskatchewan, though, could say fewer, but I'm kind of thinking that we won't. Again, it gets into an enforcement issue, and how do we do that? And we heard that time and time again from our friends in the police community. Taxation is, of course, a very important issue for municipalities, and that's all I'm going to say about that. There's some sole provincial responsibilities, and we've made some recent announcements about distribution and wholesaling of cannabis and retailing it in Saskatchewan. A province can set retail locations and rules with respect to those locations. We can set rules about public consumption of cannabis. And there are land use or zoning issues that my friend from Alberta will tell us a little bit more about, I presume, from a municipal level. So with respect to Saskatchewan's responsibilities, we have decisions to make. One is about age, so 18, 19, 21, or 25 are the most common ages being discussed. The school boards, though, came out with 22, and I had to think about why it would be 22, and the reason for that, I think, is because they can publicly fund someone going to high school up until age 21. So if they want it completely out of schools, then they say make it 22, which has some logic to it. Distribution and retail, again, 3 basic models. Public, like Ontario is going to do, for example, I think Manitoba, or completely private, which is probably the route that Alberta's taking, or a hybrid, something kind of in the middle. And that's sort of what we're starting to hear from BC maybe, because they have a huge problem with illegal marijuana dispensaries right now, and they're not sure how they're going to be able to deal with those and still sell it from a government perspective. Public consumption is another topic. If one considers how we treat alcohol and tobacco, though, how we regulate public consumption for those, you'll get a good sense of where we're probably going to go with cannabis in Saskatchewan. So if you can smoke and drink lawfully in Saskatchewan, you'll probably be able to use cannabis. But if you can't, then you won't be able to use cannabis either. We have responsibility with respect to impaired driving, of course, and the enforcement of any provincial offense that we create for cannabis. A policeman once told me that, well, in the Liquor Control and Gaming Act, if you just added cannabis wherever it says liquor, we'd probably get to where we want to go. We're not going to do that, but that's sort of a sense of where we are with respect to our analysis about this. Provincial offenses will include public consumption, illegal possession in a vehicle, using cannabis in a vehicle. We have to do something about youth and how to treat kids who have less than 5 grams of product, or 2 or 3 joints, I'm thinking, is that amount. There are obviously some municipal concerns, including zoning bylaws, land use, and workplace issues that we'll all have to work together through. We've decided and announced a private retail model for cannabis retail and for distribution. This will also, though, include online sales by these licensed retailers. We're discussing with our neighbors and other provinces how to deal with online across borders, and we haven't come to any firm conclusion about that, because it's kind of hard to close those borders, but there's some sense in trying to do so. To help us decide what to do, we were given authority by Cabinet to conduct a cannabis survey. And doggone it, it attracted a lot of attention. We had over 33,000 responses, which was, if not the largest, one of the largest surveys we've ever seen. To put that into context, when the federal government did its online survey, they got fewer responses than we did. We learned a lot from the survey. We learned that with respect to minimum age, about 25% of the respondents thought 18 was the appropriate age. About 45% thought it should be 19, and then older, 21 or 25 was 27%. Saskatchewan people thought that there should be zero tolerance for drivers who use cannabis, overwhelmingly, 58%. 3 out of 5 people who responded thought we should treat that very seriously. Even more, over 2/3 thought we should prohibit consumption in a vehicle completely. Most thought that the same penalties for alcohol driving should apply to drug driving. And SGI has introduced legislation to that effect already. A lot of people thought, though, that more needs to be done with respect to workplace safety, and I know municipalities are fully in that camp. And clarity is needed with respect to drug impairment at work or drug use at work, and it's something that we are working on, I understand. The survey results help shape Saskatchewan's framework for cannabis, and although we haven't released that framework, we will be doing so as soon as we can, and one of the last things we're waiting for is the minimum age issue. Just to sort of fill in a little bit more about the survey, private retail sales, 37%, government sales, 45%. So we've gone a little bit against the grain in announcing retail to be done privately in Saskatchewan. The main reason I understand why we went there was we didn't want to have to do a lot of bricks and mortar stuff. We didn't want to have to create a bunch of new stores in a very, very short period of time. And we didn't want specifically to co-locate. There's a word I didn't know before I picked up this file. We didn't want to co-locate liquor and drug sales. Liquor is bad enough with respect to impaired driving causes and some other health-related issues that it creates. Cannabis is the same, but when you mingle them together and you let people buy both at the same time, you just sort of exacerbate the problems of each by doing that. So we wanted to avoid that. People were asked whether there should be an excise tax, and 60% thought there should be, which is good because there's going to be. An opportunity for government to make money? Sometimes we pick that challenge up. With respect to how to use that revenue, there was a question about that, and 78%, so overwhelmingly people thought that a portion of the tax revenue should be directed to enforcement, public education, and harm reduction. That's going to be a challenge because, as we all know, when revenue comes into government, it usually goes into the general revenue fund and not to specific things. And if you want it to be used for a specific thing, and I hope some of my bosses don't see this, you have to beg to get the funding through the budget process. And that can be difficult and hard to do. So one of the concepts is that you dedicate a certain amount of those resources right off the bat that's going to go to those areas, and that less of the money would go to general revenue, and at least some of it would go to these particular areas. In terms of priority, the Saskatchewan people felt that mental health and addiction was the biggest priority, public education and prevention second, impaired driving third, and enforcement fourth. Interestingly, municipalities, it was asked whether municipalities should be given the option to pass bylaws to strictly regulate cannabis, and only 29% agreed. 57% said that they disagreed with that question, and 10% were unsure. So I'm not sure what that tells us. Municipalities, though, should still consider issues like store locations. Do you permit a store to be near a school or a daycare, for example, or a park? Or should it be a certain distance away? You should consider whether you should limit proximity of stores from each other. Should you have sort of your cannabis street, or should you require the stores to be interspersed throughout your municipality? There's advantages to both, but it's something that luckily it's something that you guys have to wrestle with and not me. Just to list a few municipal concerns, and I know there are many, and I don't mean to insult anybody by making a very short list, but clearly zoning, bylaws, land use, public consumption are issues that are very alive for municipalities. Workplace and worker safety is another, because we're, as governments, big-time employers. We have lots of people. And we have responsibilities not only to those people, but to our communities. Police detection of drug-impaired driving. Roadside detection devices are being discussed. They've been piloted or tested. Even in North Battleford was one of the Canadian test sites. Expanded drug evaluation testing. Standard field sobriety testing is SFST, and that is something that's done at roadside. So if the officer suspects someone has been using drugs, they can ask them to take this test, just like for alcohol. And if they don't do well on that test, they can be asked to provide a blood sample once the companion piece of legislation comes into force. Or they can be asked to take a drug recognition evaluation, which is done by a specially trained investigator. And it takes about an hour, and they do a battery of tests. I think there's 12 tests in total, which should enable the evaluator to determine whether the individual has taken drugs, whether they're impaired by that drug, and what type of drug that it was. There is some federal money available, and they have been trumpeting. It's $272 million or $262 million worth of funding, half of which the feds are keeping for training their own people and doing their own things. The other half they're making available to provinces. So when you consider, and I did this math for the parliamentary committee, and it went over like a lead balloon, so I won't repeat it here. but it works out to be a relatively paltry amount. And they've tried to make it fair for all Canadian jurisdictions. So they have a formula that they use, but the result of the use of that formula is that we all end up getting screwed, not at least only just some of us. The roadside screening devices are relatively expensive. They're about $3,500 to $5,000 a piece. And whenever it's used, it takes about $40 to conduct the test. So it's not an enterprise that we want to undertake without thinking about how much we can gather from its use. And it's a decision that we're continuing to address. The federal estimate for what they'll provide for Saskatchewan for device acquisition works out to be about 13 devices in Saskatchewan. Just the tiny, tiny tip of the spear that we're actually going to need to combat drug driving. So the rest of that's going to fall on SGI, it's going to fall on the province, it's going to fall on municipalities if we want to sort of go down that road in any significant way. So that's kind of how far I thought I should go today. Are there any questions or comments that people have? I know I've sort of kind of flown through this. This is a very important topic, and it's one that profoundly affects both the province and municipalities. And I'm very pleased to have been able to speak to you this afternoon. Again, there's cannabis reform at gov.sk there. If you have any specific questions that you have, I'm open to suggestion in terms of things that we should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and we can move forward together. So I don't see anyone racing to a mic. Oh, there is someone there, sorry. Number 3.
Hi, my name is Connie. I'm the CAO for the town of Elrose. I just want to clarify a couple of things here.
Sure.
My understanding is that a community needs to have a minimum population in order to have a store or a facility to grow this cannabis at?
Just with respect to the retail. In terms of having a grow operation, that's all federally licensed, so the individual would have to apply. There is no restriction on what kind of community it needs to be in, though, but it has a number of requirements that are attached to applying for the license and being able to open a cultivation facility. With respect to retail, though, SLGA had to start somewhere, and the number that they chose was 2,500 population. So those that are at 2,500 or above will be given the opportunity to retail cannabis. A community can decide not to, and SLG will respect that. So if Torquay, for example, had 2,500 people, I haven't had the pleasure of going there, but I think I will the next time I go to Minot. If it had 2,500 people, they could say, no, we don't want a retail store. And SLGA wouldn't license someone to open a store in Torquay as a result. It's created some issues, which is not surprising. But keep in mind, too, that this is the first round. So we're going to start small and get bigger if necessary. It's harder to start big and go smaller if you find out it's not working out very well. So that's kind of where they're going with that.
So what about the issue of public consumption? I know there's regulations with the public consumption of alcohol.
Yes.
And with smoking tobacco products in public. Is the province going to be behind that, or is it going to be up to the individual municipality to ensure that the smoking of cannabis isn't done, let's say, in your drugstore or your office facilities or whatever? Is that going to be carried over added to the current legislation?
We're hoping to. We are in the process of pulling together a piece of legislation to deal with cannabis in Saskatchewan. It may or may not be called the Cannabis Control Act, but it will be very similar to the legislation governing alcohol and the legislation governing tobacco.
And how soon can we expect that legislation to be completed by the provincial government in order that we can prepare for this as communities?
We have to introduce it when the we can only introduce it when the legislature starts sitting, and the sitting is scheduled for the second week of March, I think.
Thank you.
Sir?
Robert Mardell, Mayor of the Town of Choiceland. Putting on a different hat today as an employer, I'm curious as to what our rights are going to be as employers to police the consumption to the point where an employer deems his employee to be under the influence or incapacitated, and at what point are we going to be infringing on their rights by insisting that they go home because we feel that they can no longer do their duties, and that they may be endangering themselves or someone else. Being as we're having trouble with enforcement and testing, what is this going to do to the employer section of the industry?
Well, what are you doing now? Is my first question. Because you have certain rights now as an employer to deal with people who show up for work drunk or stoned. That cannabis will become legal won't change any of that. We do hope, though, to clarify that situation for employers as we move forward.
Okay. My concern is being able to perceive that someone is under the influence and that, you know, that they're able to do their duties. Whereas I'm old school, I guess. It was fairly easy with alcohol to determine whether or not somebody was still under the influence or impaired enough that they could no longer perform their duties.
Sure, because they smelt of alcohol unless they're vodka consumers. But an alcohol test will tell you how much alcohol the person has in their body, and we know what effects certain levels of alcohol has on a person. Cannabis is quite a bit different. So if we were able to detect a person at, say, 10 nanograms of cannabis or THC in their body, it's going to affect that person differently than another person. And it may be impairing for some and not for others. So it's a really thorny kind of question, and I'm sorry I can't answer it any better than that, other than I do understand your pain, and that we do hope to come up with some more clarification in this area as we move forward. Now that we have a new premier in cabinet, we should be able to get some of these things rolling out in the next month or so. And I appreciate there's not a lot of time left between now and July, and maybe the Senate will hold things up a little bit, but it's really just holding up the inevitable.
Right.
Sir?
Kevin True, Administrator for the Town of Kit River. I'm just wondering, back to the public consumption piece, we're talking in the Town of Kit River about vaping and different things happening in public parks, in public facilities. You talked about smoking and alcohol consumption, to look at that legislation. So smoking is allowed outside in most places. Alcohol is not, because you have to have a licensed area, which you can do that.
Right.
So are we looking at
Alcohol.
Yeah, so we're looking at alcohol. Thank you. That's exactly what I want to know. Okay.
Number 4, sorry.
Great, thank you
we
very
got a
much.
lineup. And I'm cutting into my friend from Alberta's time, and he may be secretly happy about that. I don't know. But he's a lawyer, so he probably likes to talk.
I look forward to that one as well. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Andrew Stevens, City of Regina, first-time councillor. I have a few remarks and some questions. The first comment really is, it almost seems as if the government is setting this up to fail, or at least not to succeed. And the reason I say that is because the comments that we heard earlier today and since the beginning is it's going to cost, it's going to cost, it's going to cost. As a way of addressing that, I want to read some numbers from one city in the state of Colorado, the city of Denver. And in that city alone, in 2018, it's expected to raise $15.1 million in revenue from a special marijuana tax. And it's going to receive about $6 million from the state. So there's two parts to this one. You conveniently glossed over the taxation component, when in reality that should be a conversation about enabling cities, through the Cities Act, to actually have the power to levy new forms of taxation. Secondly, if we start breaking down how this money is spent, the evidence all points to the reality that the economic and social benefits far outweigh the costs that I believe have been exaggerated by police forces in this province. So for instance, if we look at the cost to regulation in a national context in which it's actually still illegal federally, $2.3 million from that total of $21 million invested. Enforcement, $2.8 million, and a lot of that actually goes into enforcing other forms of more harmful drugs in the drug trade, such as opioids. Education, $3.6 million. Public health, $2.3 million. $10 million in that one city alone from marijuana revenue goes into improvement to city and facilities. So in other words, it's been an economic boom, and it's been able to offset some of the costs that you mentioned here. And I was also raising this point because I think we need to revisit how the retail system has been set up. Despite what we saw in terms of support from the public for a mixed public and private system, we went to a private retail system that is not competitive. So the logic of a competitive private system is that you have a whole bunch of entrants into the market that are able to compete. Instead, we have a very restrictive monopoly that we're enabling that's going to kind of counter the logic of us having a competitive private system. So again, we're curbing any potential revenue and economic potential seemingly through a purposeful intervention in the government here. So I'm curious here, first off, the question is, why have you not expanded taxation powers to cities to go on and reproduce what we've seen in the United States? And secondly, what's going to happen to those private retailers currently that have a customer base that are legitimate if they are subject to needless police raids in both Saskatoon and Regina? Are they going to be taken out of the candidacy for retail outlets in the future?
I'll answer that one first. And the answer to that is that an applicant for a retail license will have to be of good character. And how they determine that will be up to SLGA. Just opening a retail establishment may not get you there, but if they're charged, or if they've continued to operate when they've been asked not to, might have an effect. With respect to taxation and enabling municipal taxation on this point, that's, I'm sorry to say, far above my pay grade. And that's a question you may want to ask the ministers when they come later this week. I can say, though, that pricing cannabis is really tricky. And the reason I say that is because you don't want it priced so high, taxed so high, that people will simply ignore the retail store and go buy it on the street. Because again, one of our purposes is to deter or limit, restrict the illegal sale of the product. In terms of the numbers of stores and not opening it up completely wide, part of it relates to how I talked about enforcement of home cultivation, for example, or how much you can have in your home. There's no point having a law you can't enforce. And one of the things that we want to make sure that we do with respect to cannabis retail is to ensure that they're selling a safe product that has been purchased lawfully from a distributor or a licensed producer, that hasn't had other stuff put into it or that becomes dangerous for consumers. So the wider that net goes, the harder it is to accomplish that goal. So in terms of only 6 in Regina, for example. That doesn't sound like very many, but at the end of the day, it may not actually end up being 6. There could be more if things progress in that fashion, or we could see actually fewer if they're not taken up like they might not be taken up.
Right. I'd love to continue on with that. I don't have time, but one final remark about the interprovincial trade. I think the advantage that we have over the United States is, and I might not say this about every economic issue, but we should actually follow the government's logic about free trade interprovincially, because the more restrictions you put up, the more black market there's going to be. And again, that's a disadvantage, and the cost of enforcement in Colorado is largely due to the restriction in terms of how it crosses borders. So we avoid that. We avoid a huge amount of enforcement costs.
For sure.
Thank you.
I think I can take one more question, and I've been told that that's it, but maybe if we have time at the end, you can
Thank you,
come
sir.
up.
I have a, Jerry Whiting, Town of Fort Capel, Mayor. I have a brief question. You've clearly stated that the federal government is responsible for the medicinal use. However, one might expect that they may have shared with you their thoughts on outlets,
Yes.
similar to the retail outlets. Do you have any insight that you could share with us?
Have you heard anything Evan Bray has said recently about illegal dispensaries?
I have.
I'm in Evan's corner. We had a discussion, and you and I have talked on the phone.
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, we've had a discussion provincially amongst chiefs of police, the Federal Prosecution Service, and Justice and Corrections and Policing, and we've all come to be on the same page in terms of our consideration that these stores, even though they're saying they're selling medical marijuana to medical patients, are still operating illegally. The only way to get medical marijuana lawfully today is to get it directly from a licensed producer, not through a store.
I'm assuming then that there is no plans for the federal government, hasn't suggested they're going to change that option for...
They're not going to be changing it for a while if they are going to be changing it.
Thank you.
Okay. So again, thank you very much for your attention. You guys have been terrific. I wore my tomato-proof suit, and I didn't really need it until just recently. So thanks very much.
Over the... Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, there we go. Just want to introduce myself. My name is Lorne Randa. I'm a partner with Brownlee LLP, and I'm covering for my partner Derek King, who does send his regrets. He was ill. You may have seen him at the trade show this morning. He flew in last night, stayed for a little bit, and ended up going home and dumped this on my lap. So I'll do my best to be here in his place and share the knowledge that he was hoping to share with you this afternoon. Moving with the puns, we'll be here for your highs and lows and help you through this transition of recreational marijuana. It's just my contact there information for you. Well, what is coming? Dale has introduced this concept of what's happening with the recreational marijuana. We've had the medicinal marijuana provisions in place for a number of years. And as Dale's referred to, their licensed producers are the ones that are the only ones who are allowed to dispense that. The Cannabis Act, the federal piece of legislation, is what's going to legalize the use of recreational cannabis. And the federal legislation primarily is going to be dealing with, amongst those things that Dale spoke to, is that production side of things, with the licensed producers, the advertisement, those types of pieces. The province and the territories, they're going to be tasked with the obligation to regulate the consumption and the retail side of things. And in Saskatchewan, as Dale's referred to, it's going to be the Saskatchewan Liquor and Gaming Authority who's going to have the authority to do that. So who's going to be able to sell the cannabis? Well, the wholesaling, the retail of cannabis will be conducted by the private sector. And there are different models at different provinces. In Alberta, they're going to have a hybrid actual model. For the most part, the storefront are going to be private, but my understanding at this point in time, the online sales are going to be regulated by the province. If a province doesn't move forward with their own legislation in dealing with the retail and consumption, the federal government will. So even if the province doesn't pass any legislation that comes in force for whatever date it would be, July 1st, July 7th or whatnot, the federal government will still have an online service available for the retail purchase of cannabis. So provinces are needing to act quick here and put their own system in place. So Saskatchewan has chosen a private system. As Dale's referred to, there is going to be a selection process. So there's only going to be, at this point in time, a limited number of retail licenses that are going to be issued out. The first process, or first part of the stage, is going to be a selection criteria. So not anybody is going to be able to apply and qualify to obtain a retail license. They're going to have to meet certain criteria, one of which is the good character aspect, whatever that may be. We'll see as the legislation moves forward. It also is going to require a financial aspect, so financial viability. So in total, there's going to be the 60 retail permits that are going to be issued out amongst the 40 municipalities that have been identified as having the population number there. There'll be a lottery system at that point once they have all of the qualified applicants. And I imagine if there is a sufficient number that someone will just be selected, but I imagine that there'll be that marketplace coming in where there'll be a lottery type system. So if they are selected to obtain one of the licenses, they'll have the opportunity and the chance to run a store. The online sales, I believe, is going to be provided as well to those selected operators. Now, although there's these 40 municipalities that have been selected, municipalities can simply opt out of having a retail cannabis store located in their municipality if they choose. But opting out isn't going to mean that you're not going to have to deal with the issues associated with recreational cannabis. Municipalities will still have to deal with the issues of consumption, the issues that are going to arise with cannabis being in your municipality. Now, I'm sure everybody's seen the list, but here are the list of the 40 municipalities and the allocation of various permits for different ones. So some of the larger municipalities are going to have more retail or potentially more retail sites than others. Regina 7 and Saskatoon having 7, or sorry, Regina 6, Saskatoon 7, for example. Now, what's going to be the impact here? Municipalities are going to be impacted by this, but you're also going to have a significant role to play in the legalization of cannabis. So we can't just sit back as municipalities and not do anything. If you have not opted out, you're going to have the potential for certain retail stores in your site. And you do have tools available to you to help regulate the locations of them, where they're going to be, what conditions might be set on those. You also have the ability to regulate business, which I'll talk about all these points in a little bit more detail. So your ability to issue business license and set conditions relating to issuance of business licenses. You also have the ability to regulate certain things under your Municipal and Cities Act, such as nuisances, use of public spaces, and these are all things that you could consider when we're talking about recreational cannabis. And lastly, there's going to be the municipal law enforcement side of things. And these are just 4 main considerations. I'll touch upon a couple at the end if I have time in relation to the employment side of things as well. So land use. I'll touch base on 2 sides of land use here. I'll touch base on the commercial side as well as the retail side. So regardless of which one we're talking about, municipalities have the responsibility for regulating land use, approval of developments for both production and the recreational focused uses. So when we're talking about the commercial production, and I'll introduce a little bit about on the federal regulation side of things, how it works. Right now, the status quo stays the same. So right now, if somebody wants to have a medicinal cannabis operation, they have to apply to the federal government for a license to become a licensed producer. Knowing from another friend of mine who works for a cannabis producing company, it's a very extraneous process. It takes several months, a lot of documentation, a lot of discussions with the federal government before that's issued. During that process, there is no advance notice to a municipality before applying for the license under the Federal Act. So they can apply. You may not know it right at the beginning, but there is an obligation, if they get approved, to provide notice to a municipality. So at some point in the process, there'll be the engagement of the local municipality if you're going to have a commercial producer looking to set up shop in your municipality. Once the issue or the license is issued, though, municipalities can't prohibit an approved licensed producer. Now, we can deal with the land use side of things, but we can't outright prohibit that producer. So we're speculative as to whether it will become easier for more licenses as this process happens. Right now, the only licensed producers are the ones that are producing medicinal cannabis, and they are approved under the Cannabis Act for the recreational marijuana use to produce marijuana and cannabis for the recreational side of things. So your current producers are your current producers, but there will be likely other people coming forward looking for licenses as well. Whether that process changes, we don't know at this point in time, but we do speculate that there could be a possibility that the process either gets easier or we're going to see more licenses processed. So we do expect amendments potentially at the federal level to deal with the licensed producers. We could see there being various classes or the potential for classes of users. So I think we got a slide up here, kind of the micro brewery type thing, the micro weed type of industry. We're likely going to see more than just these large operations that we have right now producing the medicinal cannabis and going into the recreation. But I think there's also going to be the potential for micro breweries or micro weed operators trying to find a particular niche in the industry. So we may see smaller licenses producers coming forward with smaller operations focused on a certain retail market. So municipalities will still have some role here in terms of the planning process. So we can't eliminate all of the federal regulations. We can't replace them per se, but you do have an ability to indicate where production is going to happen. Right now, the licensed producers are only authorized to have indoor production, so we're typically looking at the industrial type development. That's the kind of zoning that you're going to see these types of developments in. But if we do see further changes, maybe someday we'll see that restriction removed and they'll be allowed for outdoor growth. So we may see agricultural zoning as being a potential area of land use development. At this point in time, though, it is still limited to indoor use, so we're looking at primarily industrial type developments. And there are very strenuous federal regulations regarding the consumption relating to security, as well as the control of odor and other kind of types of nuisances. But if these regulations are lessened by the federal government, there may be another role for municipalities to play a more stricter governance piece in dealing with the regulation of those issues. Now, the one that's on the top of mind of everybody here is the retail piece. So The retail sales, they will be governed by the provinces and territories. And as we've indicated in Saskatchewan here, they'll be regulated by the SLGA. At this point in time, because we don't have any proposal legislation from the government, we're not able to state with exact certainty as to what role municipalities will have in the dictating the land use, where it could be, what the setbacks may be. The legislation could be broad and give us many powers, or it could be restricting in terms of setting all of the regulations regarding setbacks, distances from various other uses or other users. Or it may even say this is what the minimum is, but municipalities could be stricter. So we could see various different types of models potentially when we're dealing with land use. But I do think it's safe to say that there's going to be some regulatory authority on the side of land use. So depending on the provincial legislation, we're going to have this opportunity for greater restrictions from the land use perspective. And likely, these will be set out in either the Act or the regulation. But as long as there's no conflict between the two pieces, we should be able to work in harmony. So from the land use perspective, these are some of the potential changes that you could see with your zoning bylaws. Update definitions, buffer distances, so distances between various uses, distances just like we see sometimes with alcohol retail, distances between one alcohol sales store from another. Special use regulations, so special conditions and requirements relating to the cannabis retail uses. Modifications to your standard land use zonings, and even potential district direct control districts. So right now, your zoning bylaws are going to have various definitions for some of these terms here: greenhouses, light industrial, general retail. And as they sit now, there's the potential that cannabis retail or cannabis production could fall within any of these definitions. So one issue that you may have to consider is whether or not you need to amend your definitions. Do we need to amend our definitions? Will we need to add definitions to deal with cannabis retail? Now, again, it's going to depend on what the provincial legislation contemplates for us to really give you certainty as to what we can be addressing within our land use. But to err on the side of caution, including these definitions should assist the municipalities in exercising greater control over the locations, the manner of occupation of sites, how these uses are undertaken on various sites. Now, each municipality's zoning bylaw is going to be distinct to your municipality, so it's difficult even for us to give you that general advice as to exactly what needs to be in your zoning bylaw. It's going to be different for each of you, but we'll cover off a few general recommendations or things that you should be considering. So some proposed new definitions that you may need to include. The term cannabis grower or cannabis producer, cannabis retail to deal with the retail stores, cannabis accessory, so items that are accessory to the cannabis, so not the actual weed product, the marijuana product, but pipes, other mechanisms that you would use for smoking or consuming marijuana, so the accessory piece, as well as the term cannabis. Well, what is the risk if you don't add these definitions? Well, the possibility is that a proposed development, particularly if it's a permitted use, so retail, general retail, if somebody comes with that application, they get that approval from the SLGA, they come forward and they apply for their development permit to build their retail store. Well, if you haven't addressed it in your land, zoning bylaw yet, they may have a permitted use right down in the middle of downtown, right beside your local school. That may not be an ideal location. So failing to address cannabis retail and cannabis accessory in your zoning bylaw now has that risk that it could be captured by an existing permitted use or discretionary use. And so you may have to issue the permit with very little ability to regulate. So this will limit or even prevent you from prohibiting development on a certain site or limiting any, or placing any limitations or controls on that permit. Another thing that you may want to consider is modifying your existing land use definitions. So in addition to adding those new definitions, you should also include limiting words. So examples with that retail or greenhouse, you could include at the end of those definitions, but does not include the sale of cannabis and cannabis accessories. So it's abundantly clear that these zones and these definitions do not contemplate cannabis retail, cannabis accessory retail. In terms of the issue of private growth within a dwelling house, so private cultivation does not really change the use, the intensity of use. It's something that can occur without, it's not like a home business that is an accessory use to being at home. So it will be very difficult to really govern this piece. So right now the province does have the option to allow the federal limits to stay, which is the 4 plants per dwelling or per dwelling house. But the province can alter that. So in Manitoba and Quebec, for example, they have prohibited any type of home cultivation, whereas some provinces have limited where the home cultivation could be. In Alberta, for example, it's limited to just indoor growth, so no plants can be grown outdoors. Now, the definition in the Federal Cannabis Act is quite broad, and it refers to any dwelling house which is defined as contiguous land to a building or structure. So it does seem to contemplate the whole parcel of land and not just the building. So the way the federal legislation is drafted, it could be indoor or outdoor unless the province says otherwise. So there will be the ability for the province to limit that. Municipalities will likely not be able to regulate this within a zoning bylaw. So if the province does accommodate it, we may be able to prescribe whether growing occurs indoor or both indoors and outdoors, but it might be very limited. There are other areas that you may need to address in the future. Right now, the legislation does not deal with edibles, so products that have cannabis in them. Right now, that's not regulated by the Cannabis Act, but it is anticipated, I believe, by 2019 at some point, 2020, that'll likely be regulated as well, which may have further implications relating to land use, further definitions that have to be addressed, such as the cannabis accessory, cannabis edibles, how those will be regulated by your land use bylaw as well. Another side that is not yet addressed, but is likely to be addressed in federal legislation in the future, is the issue of sites in which you can consume cannabis. So will the federal government allow for and regulate situations where you could have like a bar, but a cafe, a cannabis lounge? So these are all likely to be subject to future federal legislation, and then subsequently have some sort of implication on municipalities. But right now, there's still a significant uncertainty as to how these areas are going to be regulated. So another key aspect with land use here is buffers. So it was indicated by Dale that the province may address it, may not. It sounds like they may not be addressing the issue of buffers, but provided that the legislation doesn't prohibit the municipality to do it, your land use bylaw may need to deal with this issue as well. So buffers between similar uses, just like you would with alcohol, separation from schools, parks, and other public facilities, separation from other like uses, alcohol sales, alcohol consumption, and these will all have to be coordinated with the provincial regulations if it does provide for any of that. So for example, in Alberta, the Alberta legislation will be setting out the proposed, I think it's Bill 26, does set out some minimum distances that have to be established between certain facilities. But it does allow for municipalities to set even stricter buffer distances. So provided that your provincial legislation makes that clear, municipalities may be able to expand upon that. Right now, your zoning bylaws likely already deal with some of these issues for sensitive uses, so we don't see how it would be any different for cannabis. So just like you would define buffers between alcohol retail, you could establish the exact same thing for cannabis retail. Now, the key and the important part of this is making sure that your language is very clear, that it's clear as to how these distances are being calculated. Is it from corner of lot to another corner of lot? Is from the corner of the structure to another structure? Because if you aren't clear in that legislation, you're just opening it up for potential appeals to your development appeal boards. As well, you want to deal with whether or not there's going to be any variance power. So is there going to be any ability for your development authority to waive that restriction as well? You could also deal with expanded conditions and requirements. So not only can your land or your zoning bylaw deal with basic conditions, you could have specific conditions associated with these various uses. If they're permitted uses with any zoning, your zoning bylaw is going to have to be very clear as to what those conditions are going to be. Is there going to be consultation required before an approval is made? Are there valid planning purposes for making sure that there's certain setbacks, signage issues, things of that nature? Now, your bylaw must be very clear if you are going to have a consultation process, that the permit isn't approved until that consultation commences and is completed, and that your development authority has the ability to consider those input before making any decision. Other considerations at this point, a lot of these are already dealt with by federal, or some of them are dealt with by federal legislation, particularly with productions. But what kind of security plans are in place? Is your zoning bylaw going to contemplate what needs to be done to ensure proper security of these facilities? You could have conditions relating to crime prevention through environmental design planning principles incorporated into approval processes. Parking, the footprints of buildings, expansions of the minimum setbacks from various sites, and dealing with other nuisances. I only have a few more minutes, so I'll try to cover as much as I can here. Zoning revisions. So right now, your bylaws, your zoning bylaws aren't going to contemplate where these uses are. So if we've established the definitions as to what those uses are, and the government allows for that room for municipalities to deal with the land using, you're going to have to establish which zones you do want to have your cannabis retail incorporated into. So you're going to have to look into reviewing those various zones and figuring out which ones are going to be the ideal locations for cannabis retail. As well, you want to consider whether or not you want to make them permitted or discretionary uses. If they're permitted uses, as long as the applicant meets the conditions of the zoning bylaw, you're going to have to issue them. If they're discretionary, you'll have a little bit more leeway in terms of setting proper conditions and dealing with consultation and various input. So you may just decide that all those uses are discretionary to give you more control. There's also the possibility of excluding them from all your zoning and dealing with direct control districts instead. Now, if your community has already dealt with direct control districts, it may be a little bit easier to incorporate these into your zoning bylaw. If you haven't, there's a few preconditions like a community outline plan that you have to have or official community plan that you have to have in place. But it is one option where you can just have council deal with all applications for cannabis retail, and then have the ability to set various conditions for them. So that's the side of the land use bylaw. So there's still a lot of uncertainty without the actual legislation to know what we can and can't cover. But you can proactively address some of these issues already by incorporating cannabis uses into your zoning bylaw, providing those definitions, limiting out where those certain sites may not be permitted, at least at this point. And as we see the regulation and the legislation come forward, we'll have a better understanding of what more you could do within your zoning bylaw. The regulation of business, I'll just touch upon this, the other few ones here just very briefly. The first aspect is if you do opt out, everything else is going to fall into place the same way. You're not going to have a business license for a cannabis retailer if you've opted out. If you do opt in, though, you do have the ability to establishing a licensing process for cannabis users or cannabis retail uses, the ability to have subclasses for those, the ability to establish licensing fees that might be able to cover some of the costs associated with the enforcement. But keep in mind, if you do issue out special businesses license for them and set out special conditions and requirements for them, that's going to mean more measures and likely then more enforcement. So there's going to be that reciprocal additional cost associated with that. The Cannabis Act does not expressly deal with the issues of consumption of cannabis in public places. Alberta is taking the model that the regulations are going to be very similar to the use of tobacco. So locations away from doors, not able to smoke in certain public places and restaurants and facilities of that nature. So potential to be more than just at home. If the province permits, municipalities may have some authority to set setbacks as to where public consumption could occur. It could also restrict where it could happen in terms of public places, so schools, hospital, playgrounds, things that would fall within a municipality's jurisdiction. So you may still find some authority in terms of passing bylaws to create greater restrictions. Again, it'll all be dependent on what the provincial legislation actually does set. Now, with dealing with this, again, you're going to have more enforcement. So as soon as you set some restrictions relating to governance of the nuisance and having setbacks of where it could be smoked and whatnot, you're going to have a greater level of enforcement required as well. So subject to provincial regulation, you may have the opportunity to amend smoking bylaws to include additional restrictions relating to smoking and vaping of cannabis. Again, that'll all be dependent on how the province deals with it. If they prohibit it and deal with it more like alcohol, then it does take away a lot of that smoking side of things, and we're really just dealing with the private use or consumption in a private setting, or potentially later on, maybe consumption within the cannabis lounges, cafes, things of that nature. There's also the ability to regulate nuisances under Section 8 of the Municipalities Act, and to regulate the benefit of safety, health, and welfare. Again, depending on what the scope of the provincial legislation is, this may give us municipalities more room to regulate the use of cannabis in respect of these issues. So what kind of nuisances are we talking about? Well, odors from use, secondhand smoke, things of that nature. The example that we have there, if you had, let's say in an apartment, multiple users smoking on a balcony below, and above is a family and their kids are playing on the balcony, or the windows are open above their child's window, that may be considered a nuisance. Now, the issue is that you'll have to come up with what is an unreasonable level to allow for that enforcement, which may create an issue in and of itself in terms of enforcement. So different municipalities will be impacted different ways now in terms of municipal enforcement. You will have a role with this. Now, depending again how much regulation is given to the municipality will depend on how much enforcement you have. But with any enforcement, there's going to be additional training, potentially additional equipment, particularly on the impaired driving side of things. If you are enforcing nuisances or you're enforcing business licenses, again, you're going to have more resources for enforcement, more training, and more costs for administration. Just a couple interesting facts here. I'm not sure how, I read the one article, but I'm not sure how accurate these are and whether the testing was done prior to this. But apparently between the 2 years, the 2013-2016, there was an increase of 145% of motor vehicle accidents involving drivers under the influence of cannabis, and that as part of that, a 40% increase in fatal accidents overall involving cannabis impairedness. Now, part of that study, which I found interesting, is that it did preface that coroners were not required to test for cannabis. And so it's the numbers, I don't know if it necessarily would be accurate, if it was more or less, but just some interesting things to read. Just my last slide here, so looks like we're right here at the end anyway. So there's a number of potential enforcement challenges, both for the municipality and the province. Obviously, the impaired driving is going to be a key issue. I think there's also going to be the issue of minors' access to homegrown cultivation and how that gets enforced. Who will be regulating that? Who's going to be enforcing it? Will it even be enforced? Is definitely going to be an interesting issue. And as was alluded to by one of the questions, there is definitely a municipal employment impact as well. But this would likely not going to be governed any differently than the way you would deal with alcohol impairment of your employees. If there is an increased access, there's going to be likely an increased risk of impairment. But if you have somebody who you think is definitely, or somebody who you think may be impaired, you would entreat them no differently than you would if somebody came to work drunk. So if you have grounds to believe that they are, you can send them home, deal with them that way. I would invite anyone who does have specific employment questions. My partner, Colin Fetter, who's one of our employment lawyers, will be at our trade booth tomorrow. So please stop by and visit and ask some questions, and he'll be able to answer some of those questions on that side of things. So I do thank you for your time, and I know it's the last one of the day, so everybody's probably open to get out. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I will answer any questions here or on the side if you do have any questions. Thank you.
I want to thank Lorne and Dale for being here. This is one of those topics that there's lots of questions and still lots of answers to find out, so I want to thank them for being here. I also want to thank our sponsor, Myers Norris Penny. It makes these things possible when we have great sponsors like you, so thank you for doing that. So as I get to wrap up the session for the day, I also want to encourage everyone to attend our hospitality night that's happening at the Doubletree. I think it starts around 8 o'clock if I remember right, so I hope I will see everyone there. So have a great evening, and we'll see you all back here tomorrow.